"Get that bulldozer moving now. Run him over if you have to," shouted the man who'd sworn revenge after I sent his wife to prison. The massive machine lurched toward my blind brother Michael, who stood defiantly protecting his garden with just a white cane. I never thought we'd be here again, fighting for our lives 1 year after our HOA president Karen shoved Michael into a ditch and discovered I was a Supreme Court judge. But her husband Robert was back with corrupt officials using fake eminent domain claims to destroy everything we built. When I rushed to stop the bulldozer, Robert smirked. "Check your email, Justice Chen. I found your dirty little secret. Drop this fight or tomorrow everyone knows what you did." The documents would ruin my Supreme Court career, but I wasn't backing down. What Robert didn't know, Michael was secretly recording everything, and I'd spent months building a case that would expose their entire corrupt network. Now I faced an impossible choice: save my reputation or save the community that had become my brother's reason to live. The morning started like any other in our transformed community. Sunlight dappled through the canopy of Michael's expanded sensory garden, now a sprawling acre of accessible pathways, scent markers, and textured plant displays. Children from the local school were gathered around my brother, their fingers gently exploring the braille plant identifiers he'd designed. "Feel the difference between the sage and the rosemary," Michael instructed, his voice full of the passion that had been missing before we stood up to Karen's HOA tyranny. "Nature gives us so many ways to experience plants beyond just seeing them." I paused to watch from the garden entrance, briefcase in hand, about to leave for a week of hearings. In Washington, the transformation of our community over the past year had been remarkable. The old HOA board's discriminatory rules were gone, replaced by inclusive guidelines that prioritized accessibility. Property values hadn't plummeted as Karen had threatened. They'd actually increased as our neighborhood became known for its innovative approach to inclusive living. Heading to DC, Michael sensed my presence with the uncanny awareness he'd developed since losing his sight. "Big case on disability accommodations," I replied. "Your garden is actually being referenced in the amicus briefs as a model example." Michael smiled, but something in his expression seemed off. "Elizabeth, we need to talk before you go. Something strange is happening." Before he could elaborate, my phone buzzed with a news alert. I nearly dropped it when I read the headline. "County approves emergency infrastructure project through Sunflower Community." "That's odd," I said, showing my screen to Sarah, our neighbor who had helped document Karen's assault on Michael last year. "This is the first I'm hearing about any infrastructure project, and I'm on the community board." Sarah's expression darkened. "You need to see this." She pulled up her tablet, showing a county planning document dated just yesterday. A proposed water management pipeline was drawn directly through our community garden, Michael's garden. "This wasn't publicly announced," I said, scrolling through the document. "There was no community input period, no environmental assessment." "That's not all," Michael interrupted, his hands nervously working his cane. "Robert Reynolds has been seen around the neighborhood taking photos. Karen's husband." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. After Karen's conviction, Robert had avoided prison by cooperating with authorities, but he'd lost everything: his contracting business, their mansion, his standing in the community. He disappeared 6 months ago after making a scene at the courthouse, shouting that we would regret the day we crossed the Reynolds family. I made some calls to contacts at the county office, but hit wall after wall of bureaucracy. By evening, certified letters had been delivered to every home in our community. Notice of eminent domain proceedings. Vacate premises within 30 days. That night, our emergency community meeting was packed. The atmosphere was tense. Residents, who had finally found security after years of HOA abuse, now facing displacement. "They can't just take our homes for a pipeline, can they?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her hands shaking. Technically, eminent domain allows government to seize private property for public use with just compensation, I explained, but there are strict requirements: genuine public necessity, proper procedures, fair market value payment. This doesn't add up, Michael said. Why route essential infrastructure through an established neighborhood when there's vacant land half a mile east? The next morning brought our answer. I was reviewing legal precedents when Sarah called. You need to get to the garden now. I arrived to find Robert Reynolds standing with 3 men in suits and a bulldozer operator at the edge of Michael's garden. Robert's smile was venomous as he spotted me. Justice Chen, he said, emphasizing my title mockingly. How convenient. You're here. These gentlemen are from County Planning, State Water, and Riverstone Development. The tallest man stepped forward. I'm Director Wilson. This is now an active work site for critical water infrastructure. We have authorization to begin immediate clearing. Without court approval of the eminent domain filing, without proper compensation, I challenged. Wilson smiled thinly. Emergency authorization under Statute 15(4.7) for critical infrastructure. The paperwork is being processed concurrently. Concurrent processing isn't legal, I countered. And who is Riverstone Development? We're the contractor handling the pipeline installation, the third man said smoothly. We have all necessary approvals. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I'd like to see those approvals, and I find it very interesting that this emergency project wasn't on any public plans until yesterday, and happens to run directly through an award-winning accessibility garden. Robert's smile faltered slightly. You should know, he said quietly, fighting this will be costly, very costly, for everyone involved. As we argued, I noticed Michael had slowly made his way down the garden path, his cane tapping methodically. He stopped directly in front of the bulldozer. This garden doesn't just belong to me, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. It belongs to every child who learned plants aren't just for seeing. It belongs to every elderly resident who found community here after years of isolation. You'll have to go through me first. The bulldozer operator looked uncertainly at Wilson, who nodded slightly. Start clearing, Wilson ordered coldly. We have authorization. The bulldozer engine roared to life, its massive treads beginning to move toward my blind brother, who stood unflinching, his white cane planted firmly in the garden soil. Neighbors who had gathered gasped in horror as the machine advanced. Stop! I screamed, running toward Michael, my heart pounding with terrible déjà vu. Once again, my brother in danger because of his garden. Once again, powerful people who thought they were above the law. The bulldozer continued forward, now just feet from Michael. I lunged for him just as Sarah and 2 neighbors began live-streaming the confrontation. The operator finally cut the engine, but not before the massive blade had crushed the garden entrance and several plant beds. This is assault, I said shakily, standing protectively beside Michael. And it's on video from multiple angles. Wilson smirked, unmoved. Your brother is obstructing a legal government operation. Remove him or we'll have him arrested. That afternoon, my phone rang with an unknown number. Justice Chen, a distorted voice said when I answered. Check your email immediately. The email contained documents about a sealed case from my days as a district attorney. A case where I'd made an ethical compromise to put away a dangerous criminal. Nothing illegal, but questionable enough to damage my reputation if exposed. The email ended ominously. Drop your opposition to the infrastructure project or this goes public tomorrow. They're blackmailing a Supreme Court justice, Michael said incredulously when I told him. I spent that night poring over property records, county minutes, and campaign finance reports. By morning, I'd connected Riverstone Development to Shell, companies owned by Robert Reynolds and 3 county commissioners. The emergency pipeline wasn't about water management. It was about revenge, corruption, and seizing valuable property through fraudulent means. I faced an impossible decision: fight and risk my career, reputation, and possibly even my position on the court, or surrender and watch our community and my brother's life's work be destroyed. They think they've backed me into a corner, I told Michael as we sat in my home office, surrounded by documents, legal pads filled with notes, and 3 laptops running different searches. Dawn light was just beginning to filter through the windows after our sleepless night. But they've miscalculated badly. Michael's expression was grim. If those documents get out, then I'll face the consequences, I interrupted. But I won't be blackmailed, not by Robert Reynolds, not by corrupt officials, not by anyone. I picked up my phone and dialed the FBI field office that had handled Karen's case last year. Agent Morales, it's Justice Chen. Remember when you said if I ever needed anything? Well, I need something and it's urgent. Within hours, we'd assembled an unlikely alliance in my living room. FBI Agent Morales, 2 investigative journalists who had covered Karen's conviction, disability rights lawyer Alicia Washington, and Judge Raymond Torres from the Federal District Court, a former colleague known for his unwavering integrity and lightning-fast emergency injunctions. The evidence is compelling, Agent Morales said, reviewing the connections I'd mapped between Reynolds, the county commissioners, and Riverstone Development. Classic corruption scheme: create a fake emergency, bypass normal procedures, award no-bid contracts to themselves, and along the way, destroy the garden that symbolizes their defeat last year. Michael added bitterly. Judge Torres frowned at the blackmail email on my screen. Elizabeth, this is a direct attempt to obstruct justice by threatening a sitting Supreme Court justice. This goes beyond corruption into federal territory. I know, I said quietly, and I'm prepared to address my past actions in that case if it comes to that. But first, we need to stop the bulldozers. By noon, Torres had issued an emergency injunction halting all work on the infrastructure project pending review. I'd filed formal complaints with the Department of Justice Public, Integrity Section alleging corruption and misuse of eminent domain powers. The journalists had published the first in a series of exposés on the suspicious connections between county officials and Riverstone Development. Robert Reynolds' response was immediate and vicious. The documents about my old case were leaked to every major news outlet with the subject line, "Supreme Court Justice's Dirty Secret." Camera crews descended on our neighborhood. My phone exploded with calls from fellow justices, the Chief Justice, congressional leaders. I ignored them all and focused on preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. It arrived the next morning. Robert Reynolds, flanked by the county officials and their lawyers, strutted into the emergency public hearing that Judge Torres had convened in the community center, the same room where I'd exposed Karen's corruption a year earlier. "Justice Chen," Robert announced loudly as I entered, "your career is over. By this time tomorrow, there will be impeachment proceedings against you. Enjoy your last day as a judge." The room was packed. Residents, reporters, lawyers, and, to my surprise, 3 of my colleagues from the Supreme Court who had flown in overnight in solidarity. Judge Torres called the hearing to order. "We're here to address allegations of corruption and fraud in the proposed eminent domain action against Sunflower Community." Robert's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is a legitimate emergency infrastructure project. The county has statutory authority to build a pipeline that mysteriously doesn't appear on any planning documents before last week," I interrupted, approaching the front. "A pipeline whose proposed route changed 3 times until it conveniently ran directly through an award-winning accessibility garden." I projected onto the wall a timeline showing the suspicious sequence of events and connections between Reynolds and the officials. "This isn't about infrastructure. This is about revenge and corruption." Robert laughed dismissively. "Rich accusations from someone who buried evidence to win a case. Your Honor, Justice Chen's credibility is compromised. Her allegations are desperate attempts to distract from her own misconduct. The room tensed. This was the moment they thought they had me. I took a deep breath. Your Honor, 10 years ago, as a district attorney, I made a decision in the Williams case that I've reflected on many times since. I didn't suppress evidence, as Mr. Reynolds claims, but I did delay sharing certain witness statements that might have helped the defense. It was technically within procedural boundaries, but ethically questionable. Murmurs rippled through the room. I'm not proud of it, I continued, and I'm prepared to face any appropriate review of my actions. But that has nothing to do with the fact that Robert Reynolds and these officials are attempting to misuse eminent domain powers for personal enrichment and revenge. At that moment, Agent Morales entered with 2 other FBI agents. Your Honor, we have arrests to make. They approached the county officials, who suddenly looked panicked. We've obtained warrants based on evidence of wire fraud, conspiracy, and attempted bribery of federal officials, Morales announced. Specifically, we have recordings of Mr. Reynolds and Director Wilson here discussing how they would split the profits after acquiring the community properties and reselling them to commercial developers. The color drained from Robert's face. That's a lie. You have nothing. Actually, came a voice from the back of the room. Michael stood holding up his phone. They have everything. When you were in my garden yesterday threatening me, you didn't realize my phone was recording in my pocket. I may be blind, but I'm not helpless. The audio played clearly through the room's speakers. Robert and Wilson discussing their foolproof plan to use the fake infrastructure project to seize the valuable community land, how they'd make millions when that eyesore garden is paved over for retail, and explicitly mentioning bribing officials to rush approvals. You set me up, Robert hissed, lunging toward Michael. I stepped between them. No, Robert, you did this to yourself, just like Karen did. You thought my brother's disability made him an easy target. You thought my position meant I could be blackmailed. You underestimated us both, again. The community garden's 1-year anniversary celebration was more meaningful than we could have imagined. Where bulldozers had threatened destruction, children now played between blossoming sensory stations. The Karen Reynolds Memorial Bench, a slightly petty but satisfying tribute, sat at the entrance, engraved with "Justice Grows Here." Robert and his corrupt officials faced federal charges, their scheme exposed nationwide. My Supreme Court colleagues stood by me after I voluntarily submitted to an ethics review about my old case. The finding: questionable judgment but no disqualifying misconduct. Michael's garden has become a national model, with 5 similar projects breaking ground across the country. The Supreme Court recently heard a landmark case on disability accommodations where I proudly recused myself because Michael was an expert witness. You know what I learned from all this? Michael said as we watched sunset paint the garden in golden light. Power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from standing your ground when someone tries to push you down, literally or figuratively. Smiled. And justice isn't just about courtrooms. Sometimes it's about gardens and brothers and communities brave enough to fight back. Twice.